Friends, welcome back my YouTube channel. If you want to watch the super hit movie 12 Strong in full HD, then first of all, give this video a like, and if you are visiting our channel for the first time, then subscribe to this channel. The name of the movie we are going to discuss in today's video is 12 Strong. So we will give you information about how and where you will get to watch 12 Strong film officially. Apart from this, we will give you a detailed look at the pre-production, post-production, budget, box office collection, and filming of this movie. A detailed review of the movie will also be given in this video where we will explain the story of this movie in detail. We will also discuss the cast and casting performance of the movie. Apart from this, information about the music department and technical department will also be given. Because of this video is going to be very interesting and entertaining. So, you must watch this video till the end. And if you haven't liked this video yet, then like this video now and subscribe to this channel. So, let's start the video title. Strong is a 2018 American action war film directed by Nicolai Fuglsig and written by Ted Talley and Peter Craig. The film is based on Doug Stanton's non-fiction book Horse Soldiers, which tells the story of U.S. Army Special Forces sent to Afghanistan immediately after the September 11th attacks and up to the fall of Mazar-i-Sharif. The film stars Chris Hemsworth, Michael Shannon, Michael Peña, Navid Negahban, Trevante Rhodes, Jeff Stoltz, Thad Luckenbill, Ben O'Toole, William Fichtner, and Rob Riggle. Principal photography began in January 2017 in New Mexico. The film was released in the United States on January 19, 2018 by Warner Bros. Pictures in standard and IMAX theaters. It received mixed reviews from critics, who praised the cast and action but criticized the by-the-numbers execution and lack of insight of the war in Afghanistan. Plot. Mitch Nelson, a U.S. Army captain with Green Berets Operational Detachment Alpha, ODA 595, is moving into a new home with his wife and daughter on September 11, 2001, after receiving an assignment to staff duty under Lieutenant Colonel Bowers. As news of the devastating terrorist attacks that day breaks, Nelson volunteers to lead 595 into Afghanistan. Bowers initially refuses, but veteran soldier CW5 Hal Spencer, previously scheduled to retire, persuades Bowers to give Nelson command of 595 again, as well as volunteering himself for the deployment. After leaving their families, 595 travels to Uzbekistan on October 7, 2001. After being briefed and evaluated by COL Mulholland, commander of 5th Special Forces Group, Nelson and 595 are picked to fight alongside Northern Alliance leader Abdul Rashid Dostum. ODA 595 is inserted covertly in Afghanistan aboard Boeing CH-47 Chinook, flown by 160th SOAR on October 19, 2001. They land 40 miles south of Mazar-i-Sharif, the country's fourth largest city and a longtime stronghold of the Taliban, where they meet Dostum. 6 of the 12 members, led by Nelson, leave with Dostum to the mountains, while the other 6 remain in a fortified camp nicknamed the Alamo under Spencer's command. Dostum is attempting to capture the northern Afghanistan city while battling Taliban leader Mullah Razan, who rules local communities brutally under strict law of Sharia and has murdered several people, including Dostum's family. Although the warlord is initially skeptical of Nelson's abilities, Nelson gradually earns Dostum's respect. In one battle, however, Dostum makes a tactical error, costing several casualties. Nelson accuses Dostum of acting carelessly with the lives of his men and of withholding valuable information, while Dostum retorts that he still feels that Nelson and the U.S. are not willing to pay the potential price of the conflict, and tells Nelson that he needs to use his heart and mind to be a warrior instead of a soldier. The two eventually reconcile, and after splitting off a 3-man element under SFC Sam Diller to strike a Taliban supply route, and being joined by Spencer's half of ODA 595, continue to work together. They win several victories with Dostum's leadership and manpower and American air power, making significant progress towards Mazar-i-Sharif. When Nelson informs Dostum that another ODA 555 has been dispatched to support Atta Muhammad, another Northern Alliance leader who is Dostum's political rival, Dostum is furious, and his men promptly abandon 595. Following Dostum's departure, Nelson plans to continue operating against the Taliban with his Americans and the few Afghan fighters remaining with them. Encountering a large force of Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in armored vehicles, ODA 595 rejoined by Diller and his element, uses air support to eliminate many of the fighters and most of the armor, but are discovered and attacked. Spencer is critically injured by a suicide bomber, and the team is about to be overrun under heavy Taliban and Al-Qaeda pressure when Dostum returns with his forces. Carrying out the U.S. Army's first cavalry charge of the 21st century, the American and Northern Alliance forces disperse the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and Dostum tracks down and kills Razan. After Spencer is medevaced, Nelson and Dostum continue to Mazar-e-Sharif, but find Atta Muhammad has beaten them there. Against expectations, Dostum leaves any differences with Muhammad to be settled the next day. Impressed by Nelson and the Americans' efforts, Dostum gives Nelson his prized riding crop and tells him that he will always consider Nelson a brother and fellow fighter. At the same time bidding him, remember that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. Spencer ultimately survives, and all 12 soldiers of ODA 595 return home after 23 days of almost continuous fighting in Afghanistan. Cast: Chris Hemsworth as Captain Mitch Nelson, U.S. Army Special Forces officer and ODA 595's commander, inspired by Mark Nutch. Michael Shannon as Chief Warrant Officer Hal Spencer, a U.S. Army Special Forces Chief Warrant Officer 5, and ODA 595's Assistant Team Leader, inspired by Bob Pennington. Michael Peña as Sergeant First Class, Sam Diller, ODA 595's Intelligence Sergeant First Class, Navid Negaban as General A.R. Dostum, a leader of the Northern Alliance and future Vice President of Afghanistan, Trevante Rhodes as Sergeant First Class, Ben Milo, a Special Forces Weapons Sergeant in ODA 595, William Fixner as Colonel John F. Mulholland, Commander of 5th Special Forces Group, Jeff Stoltz as Sean Coffers, a member of ODA 595, Thad Luckenbill as Vern Michaels, a member of ODA 595, Ben O'Toole as Scott Black, a member of ODA 595 Production. Development. On December 2nd, 2011, it was announced that producer Jerry Bruckheimer had taken out the script by Ted Talley and rewritten by Peter Craig, with Nicolai Fuglsig attached to direct, which was bought by Walt Disney Pictures in 2009 for Bruckheimer, based on Doug Stanton's nonfiction book Horse Soldiers. On March 29, 2016, Deadline Hollywood reported that Bruckheimer had officially hired Fuglsig to make his feature film directorial debut, which would be co-financed and produced by Molly Smith, Trent Luckenbill, and Thad Luckenbill through Black Label Media, along with Bruckheimer's Jerry Bruckheimer Films. Casting. On September 30th, 2016, Chris Hemsworth and Michael Shannon were cast in the film, and later on November 1st, Michael Peña also joined the film. On November 3rd, 2016, Trevante Rhodes was cast in the film. On November 14th, 2016, Austin Stowell was cast in the film to play Staff Sergeant Fred Falls, an American soldier on the elite U.S. Special Forces team. Lionsgate would handle the film's distribution. On November 15th, 2016, Austin Haber was cast to play SFC Pat Essex, the intellectual and engineer of the team. And the same day it was reported that Ben O'Toole had also been cast for an unspecified role. On November 17th, 2016, Variety reported that Navid Negaban was cast to play General Abdul Rashid Dostum in the film. Elsa Pataki was revealed to be appearing in the film in December 2016, while on February 3, 2017, Deadline Hollywood reported that Rob Riggle joined the film to play Army Lieutenant Colonel Max Bowers, under whom Riggle actually served while he was a U.S. Marine captain. Filming. Principal photography began in early January 2017 in New Mexico. Mines near Oro Grande, New Mexico were used. Later, the shooting took place in Socorro, where it ended on January 26th after 8 days of filming. The film was also shot in Alamogordo, using White Sands National Monument as the shooting location. The scenes involving military encampments were filmed using 20 structures leased from AKS Military, a private manufacturer of military shelters. Postscript. The film's postscript reads as follows. Against overwhelming odds, all 12 members of the U.S. Army Special Forces ODA 595 survived their mission. The capture of Mazar-i-Sharif by the horse soldiers and their counterparts is one of the U.S. military's most stunning achievements. Military planners predicted it would take 2 years. Task Force Dagger did it in 3 weeks. Al-Qaeda considers this to be their worst defeat. Because their mission was classified, the men of Special Forces ODA 595 returned home to their everyday lives with no fanfare or public acknowledgement of the near-impossible mission they completed. In 2014, General Dostum became Vice President of Afghanistan. Dostum and Mitch Nelson remain close friends to this day. In 2012, to honor their extraordinary heroism, a statue of a horse soldier was dedicated at the World Trade Center site. Release: Homa Media. Warner Bros. Home Entertainment released 12 Strong digitally April 10th and on Blu-ray disc and DVD May 1. Blu-ray extras include the featurettes 12 Strong, The Making of an Impossible Mission, and Monumental Effort, Building America's Response Monument. Reception: Box office. 12 Strong grossed $45.8 million in the United States and Canada, and $25.3 million in other territories, for a worldwide total of $71.1 million against a production budget of $35 million. In the United States and Canada, 12 Strong was released on January 19, 2018, alongside Den of Thieves and Forever My Girl, as well as the wide expansions of Phantom Thread, I, Tanya, and Call Me By Your Name, and was projected to gross $20 million from 3-2 theaters in its opening weekend. It ended up debuting to $15.8 million, similar to the $16.1 million that another war film, 13 Hours. The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi opened to in January 2016 and finished second at the box office behind Jumanji. Welcome to the Jungle. According to ComScore, 55% of the opening weekend audience was male, with 79% being over the age of 25. The following week dropped 45% to $8.6 million, finishing sixth at the box office. Critical response. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 50% based on 173 reviews and an average rating of 5.50/10. The website's critical consensus reads, 12 Strong has a solid cast, honorable intentions, and a thrilling, fact-based story, all of which are occasionally enough to balance a disappointing lack of depth or nuance. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 54 out of 100, based on reviews from 43 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of A on an A+ to F scale, while Post-Track reported filmgoers gave an 81% overall positive score and a 63% definite recommend. Richard Roper of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film 2.5 out of 4 stars, saying, Gazas, with a running time of 2 hours and 10 minutes, 12 Strong has at least 20 minutes of scenes that are either unnecessary or repetitive. It winds up being an almost good film about some great American soldiers. Owen Gleiberman of Variety wrote, on its own terms, the film is watchable enough, but it's blunt and stolid and undercharacterized, and at 130 minutes it plods. Gleiberman notes that the soldiers riding on horseback do not amount to much, but praises the director and cinematographer for using the New Mexico locations to conjure the landscape of Afghanistan, calling it the most impressive aspect of the film. Understated isn't a word you'd ordinarily use to describe a Jerry Bruckheimer production, but that's surprisingly what 12 Strong ends up being. That's not to say it's completely restrained by any means. In telling a tale of real-life heroism against staggering odds, this is a rousing war picture, meant to stir equal amounts of excitement and patriotism. Set soon after the attacks of September 11, 2001, 12 Strong is packed with protracted battle sequences, full of deafening bombings and seemingly endless amounts of gunfire. The cumulative effect is draining. You'll walk out of the theater with the feeling that you, too, have gone to war, and an appreciation for those who are brave enough to do so themselves. But Danish commercial director Nicolai Fuglsig, making his feature filmmaking debut, draws on his previous experience as a photojournalist to bring a sense of gritty realism to the action, rather than sweeping sentimentality. The vibrant sound design also plays a crucial role in immersing us, as does a score that increasingly cranks up the tension. It's all solid from a technical perspective. Where the film could have used more power is in its narrative momentum. Based on the screenplay from Ted Talley, The Silence of the Lambs, and Peter Craig, The Town. It's self-inspired by Doug Stanton's book Horse Soldiers, The Extraordinary Story of a Band of U.S. Soldiers Who Rode to Victory in Afghanistan. 12 Strong eventually feels overlong and repetitive, and the impressive lineup of actors comprising the ensemble cast can only do so much with their thinly drawn characters. Chris Hemsworth leads them all as Captain Mitch Nelson, the head of a dozen Green Berets who were the first American troops to set foot in Afghanistan after 9/11. Among his men are the older and more experienced Chief Warrant Officer, Hal Spencer, Michael Shannon, wisecracking Sam Diller, Michael Peña, and weapons expert Ben Milo, Moonlight star Trevante Rhodes. Their orders come from the no-nonsense Colern Mulholland, William Fichtner, and the thoroughly unamused Lieutenant Colern Bowers, comedian Rob Riggle, a Marine Corps veteran himself in a rare dramatic role. Their mission is to enter northern Afghanistan through Uzbekistan with the help of the Uzbek warlord General Dostum Navid Negahban, who has his own reasons for taking on the Taliban. Together with Dostum and his men, Nelson and his team must capture the Afghan city of Mazar-e-Sharif, a Taliban stronghold. But despite their extensive training and boundless bravery, the American troops don't realize they're going to have to navigate this unforgiving terrain, which notoriously has destroyed empires for centuries, on horseback. And they'll have to do it before the winter freeze comes in 3 weeks. It's an amazing story, but also an absurd sight. Muscular soldiers strapped with high-tech gear and weaponry, galloping along on horses, facing down massive tanks and rocket launchers. Fuglsig depicts these showdowns in relentless, unflinching fashion. He's methodical, but he finds room for swagger, especially when it comes to Hemsworth's character. One of the more compelling dynamics here is the way everyone underestimates Nelson, which isn't what you'd ordinarily expect in a character the hunky Hemsworth plays. Here, he's too pretty, too young. He has too little field experience and constantly has to prove himself. And this is especially true within the ever-evolving relationship between Nelson and the mystically wise Dostum. Negahban is formidable, but he brings a much-needed calm to the tense proceedings. Naturally, Hemsworth is up to the physical demands of the role. He is Thor after all, but he never gets enough credit for his acting chops, both dramatic and comedic. He also has a nice buddy chemistry with both Shannon and Peña. But except for a sweet subplot involving Rhodes' character, the remainder of the team barely registers. They are ideas. They are cogs. Similarly, 12 Strong as a whole isn't terribly interested in going any deeper into the larger ramifications of the United States' prolonged involvement in Afghanistan. That's not its purpose, though, and that's not why you're here. You're here to feel good, if only for a little while, about some men who were great. 12 Strong Review, this fact-based war film from producer Jerry Bruckheimer, is a slick and muscular production. But like so many muscles in Hollywood, it all feels rather fake. Steroidal and pumped up rather than legitimately hard-won. The story of the first Special Forces team to be deployed to Afghanistan after 9/11, if 12 Strong doesn't exactly rewrite history, it certainly misleads by selective omission. Chris Hemsworth stars as the inexperienced captain of an elite team of soldiers who are choppered into Taliban-held territory to make contact with a warlord. Their mission is to call in airstrikes, but due to the terrain, the Americans find themselves fighting on horseback, like the Afghan warriors they battle alongside. The competent action sequences borrow the cinematic language of the Western as well as the war movie. These are heavily armed cowboys, whooping their way into the fray, dodging missiles rather than arrows. Their triumph is America's triumph. But large chunks of audience memory loss are required for it to be viewed as such. Plot: the true story of the Army's Special Forces Green Berets, who within weeks responded to the 9/11 attack. Green Berets, with the help of the 160th SOAR-A, took over the country and allowed other special forces and the rest of the conventional military to begin the more publicly visible war. Review: minor spoilers ahead. I missed this when it was in theaters, but it was one of my in-flight movies the other day, so I thought I would finally check it out. It's nice to see Chris Hemsworth in something other than a Marvel flick, and despite the odd slip in his accent, he does a decent job in 12 Strong. It's also good to see Michael Shannon play a total hero for once rather than a villain or weirdo, even if he doesn't get all that much to do. As we all know, 12 Strong is based on the amazing true story of a group of Green Berets who take on the Taliban on horseback after 9/11. There are some rousing action sequences, however. The fact that is based on the true story means there are few surprises and the ending is a little flat. It's essentially a men on a mission movie, and despite not being particularly harrowing, it still manages to be patriotic without ever going over the top. True tales of heroism are always enjoyable to watch, and with Jerry Bruckheimer producing, then we know the action will be done well. It takes a little while for anything to happen, but it's all building up the story and developing characters, so we get to know and care what happens to them. The aerial photography is stunning, with some great battle scenes, and the bombing sequences are visceral and exceptionally well done with minimal noticeable CG. The fact that the men were on horseback was a feat in itself, making this real-life story even more incredible. Overall, there's not much else to say. You could do a lot worse than watch 12 Strong on a Saturday night, or Sunday if you're feeling crazy. As it's a thrilling true story with some spectacular action sequences, even if it does take a little while to get going. 16 years after U.S. troops landed in Afghanistan, the conflict there might be summed up as a violent holding pattern, or a stalemate we're still mired in, or, if you squint hard enough, a slow-motion qualified success. But only the producer Jerry Bruckheimer would seek to portray it as a victory decisive enough to be called a triumph of the kick-ass American spirit. 12 Strong, one of those rare, serious Bruckheimer productions, tells the story of the first U.S. soldiers to land in Afghanistan in the days after 9/11. The members of ODA 595, an elite special forces unit that was ordered to link up with a local warlord and fight its way, village by village, to the Taliban stronghold of Mazar-e-Sharif, the country's fourth largest city. There, they would theoretically gut the Taliban's nexus of power and topple the ability of Afghanistan to serve as a training ground for al-Qaeda troops. Chris Hemsworth, in thatchy dark hair and a G.I. Joe scruff, speaking in a manly, low voice of superstar resolve, plays the team's captain, Mitch Nelson, who has never been in combat before. Yet he's the kind of gung-ho volunteer who's got sharpshooting in his blood. He may not have killer eyes, the warlord's description of Michael Shannon's chief warrant officer, but he's got a killer heart. A family man who only recently arranged to become a desk jockey, Nelson, as the movie presents it, gets slapped awake by 9/11 and fights the bureaucracy to win his shot on the ground. As soon as he arrives, he's a master of everything. The weather patterns, how to map bombing coordinates for the B-52s that are going to blow Taliban-infested villages into the afterlife, and, oh, of course, how to ride into battle on a horse while blasting a machine gun like a badass medieval knight. The American soldiers of ODA 595 defeated the Taliban fighters they were up against, scoring an early blow against the forces of Islamic terrorism. Yet the Taliban, the last time anyone checked, hasn't exactly jumped ship. And the whole issue of what we've accomplished in Afghanistan, forcing the enemy to a degree to go elsewhere, remains more than a little murky. 12 Strong, though, builds a hermetic screen around the first 3 weeks of the conflict, holding it up to the light as if to say, "Don't believe the naysayers, American heroism still rocks." I believe that American heroism still does, but that doesn't make 12 Strong an illuminating or overly exciting war film. It's more like cheerleading with ballistics. On its own terms, the film is watchable enough, but it's blunt and stolid and under-characterized, and at 130 minutes, it plods. If there's anything that great war films like Saving Private Ryan or The Hurt Locker have taught us, it's that victory in combat doesn't look like a street fight action movie set in a wilderness hellhole. But 12 Strong is a war film that wants you to feel good about the invincibility of American power. The film is built like a grungy combat video game, with each village treated like a new level and the agony of battle taking a back seat to the pounding thrill of force. The villain is a dastardly Taliban commander, Syed Tagmawi, who looks like a ratty gutter snipe Frank Zappa in black rags. He's introduced executing a woman in front of her 2 tearful daughters for the crime of reading. That's not an exaggeration of Taliban cruelty, but the way the film uses this brute to personify evil is at once reductive and uninteresting. He's scary, though not as scary as William Fichtner, as a shaven-headed colonel who glowers like Gollum. That said, 12 Strong is only mildly demagogic. It salutes the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, building token hints of drama around the relationship between Capt. Nelson and General Abdul Rashid Dostum, Naveed Nagahban, the Northern Alliance warlord he fights alongside but clashes with when it comes to military strategy. The two have something to teach each other, and I kept thinking how much this relationship would have popped in a David Lean film. But the script of 12 Strong, written by Ted Talley and Peter Craig, adapting the 2009 bestseller Horse Soldiers, is pretty bare bones. When the general accuses Captain Nelson of being a soldier and not a warrior, we're eager to see Nelson grow into one, but the film barely bothers to demonstrate the difference. The novelty that's the chief selling point of 12 Strong, the fact that the members of ODA 595 rode horses to make it through the treacherous terrain, doesn't amount to very much. They all seem to know how, and it's not as if contemporary soldiers on horseback look any more exotic than cowboys and Indians. The film's most impressive aspect is its arid landscapes. 12 Strong was shot in New Mexico, with the mountains there doubling for Afghanistan's famously craggy and forbidding tableau, and the director Nicolai Fuglsig and cinematographer Rasmus Videbeek used the locations to conjure what it might look like to wage war in an endless, sprawling no man's land. Visually, the terrain comes close to raising an existential question. What exactly are we fighting for in Afghanistan? The film slips in the pointed and now rather outdated argument that if the Taliban can be defeated and Afghanistan eliminated as an al-Qaeda base, then there will be no more attacks like 9/11. Well, there haven't been. But is that the reason why? 12 Strong lends a shape of supreme purpose to a conflict that is still in search of one. I'm not really sure what the point of 12 Strong, the declassified true story of the horse soldiers, is. On the surface, it seems to be a rah-rah true story of exceptional American soldiers teaming with Afghan fighters to score a crucial victory in the early days of the Afghanistan War. But as the war in Afghanistan drags into its 16th year with no end in sight, or even parameters for victory, 12 Strong comes off blissfully unaware of how its heroic victories now seem like Pyrrhic ones. Rather than illuminate a conflict that has engulfed our country for almost a generation, 12 Strong is content to be a third-rate action movie, wasting its talented cast in a well-intentioned but ultimately lackadaisical picture. The day after 9/11, Captain Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth, charges into his office and demands to be reunited with his team. After some assistance from his friend and chief warrant officer Hal Spencer, Michael Shannon, Nelson, Spencer, and 10 of their fellow soldiers, codenamed Task Force Dagger, head to Uzbekistan where they're briefed on a mission of retaking a vital Taliban stronghold. Nelson's mission is to meet up with rebel leader General Dostum, Navid Negahban, win his trust, and work with his forces to bring down the vital Taliban outpost at Mazar-e-Sharif. For 12 Strong, the mission is the message, and Nicolai Fuglsig's movie never reaches further than the good American soldiers fight with good Afghanistan soldiers to bring down the bad Taliban men. Along the way, there are brief acknowledgments that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires and that the war is far from over. But rather than consider the long-term ramifications, 12 Strong just wants the comfort of good guys versus bad guys on a battlefield. That's not to diminish the real heroism and courage of the actual soldiers who fought, but it is a criticism against the limited scope of the story 12 Strong seeks to tell. The only moments where 12 Strong becomes remotely interesting is when we get a glimpse of Dostum. In addition to Negahban's calm, measured performance, we see a character with a rich backstory, someone who has been embroiled in conflict for pretty much his entire life, suffered personal losses, and understands the difference between a soldier and a warrior. But as all too often the case in these tired narratives, the native character is pushed into a supporting role so that the American, who is almost always a white guy, can learn a valuable lesson and return a similar lesson to that supporting character. In the case of 12 Strong, we get Mitch Nelson, and Hemsworth is fine. It's kind of remarkable to see how well Hemsworth succeeds when given a well-rounded character like in Thor. Ragnarok to how much he becomes just another pretty face when playing the one-dimensional Nelson. There's nothing to build on, so Hemsworth just plays the stoicism and charm of the leader without being able to really add any depth. His co-stars suffer a similar fate despite including great actors like Shannon, Michael Peña, Trevante Rhodes, and William Fichtner. 12 Strong isn't hurting for talent. It's hurting for a script that will make use of that talent. Instead, it's just another rote war movie that would rather be an action film rather than consider the weight of war, whether it's this conflict or any conflict. Yes, there's the stakes of, will these men make it home alive? But that's the stakes in any war film, and one that becomes cheapened when more attention is paid to stunts with horses than any character development. The true story of the horse soldiers is remarkable, but the movie about them is sadly forgettable. A majority of war films made post-1970 fell into this category, with traditional throwback fare representing exceptions. AI 12 Stronga fits into the exception category. The tone falls just short of the macho, kick-ass feeling of a fictional action story. Although the film acknowledges that war isn't exclusively a raw experience, it tends toward glorifying combat rather than emphasizing its dehumanizing aspects. Of course, that's by intent. Director Nicolai Fuglsig, making his feature debut, has set out to provide a testosterone-laced visceral account of events in Afghanistan during October 2001. His intention isn't to offer a dark exploration of the impact of war on the psyche. To that extent, he is successful. The battle scenes are well filmed, replete with the requisite doses of adrenaline. There are instances of suspense and moments of intensity. Although the characters are all types, the performances are strong enough that we identify with them despite their lack of depth. The story at the foundation of Fat 12 Stronga is based on the events related in Doug Stanton's non-fictional book, A Horse Soldiers. Some changes have been made to allow for a more cinematic experience, but the essence of the narrative remains true to what really happened. Still, those interested in the full account are pointed toward the book. Fuglsig's adaptation is interested primarily in pacing and excitement. The filmmaker's few attempts to expand the canvas generally don't work. The opening scenes, which establish family relationships, feel trite and perfunctory. Equally unconvincing is the relationships between one of the soldiers and the Afghan boy assigned to be his protector. There's also an out-of-place sequence showing a Taliban mole killing a teacher for instructing girls in reading and math. I suppose this is intended to emphasize the evil of the Taliban, but it feels gratuitous and unnecessary. Following a brief prologue set on and shortly after September 11, 2001, Coma A-12, Stronger takes the action to Afghanistan, where a detachment of Green Berets joins forces with warlord Abdul Rashid Stam Navad Nagaban, one of the leaders of the Northern Alliance. Although DSM's goal is to take Mazar Sharif from the Taliban, this proves to be a tactically difficult task, even with U.S. air support. The 12 Green Berets are led by Captain Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth, and his Chief Warrant Officer Hal Spencer, Michael Shannon. Other notable members of the group are Sergeant Sam Diller, Michael Peña, and Sergeant Ben Milo Tfence. Arguably the most interesting aspect of the battle for Mazar Sharif is the way it combines 18th century equipment and tactics with state-of-the-art late 20th century weaponry. To that end, Nelson and his compatriots charge into battle on horseback, a broken bar after calling and bombing runs from B-52s cruising at $30,000 FT. Donald Rumsfeld referred to this attack as the first American cavalry charge of the 21st century. Lack of psychological complexity and character development shouldn't be held against the 12 strong. The movie does a good job at what it sets out to and will likely please the target demographic. Those who have appreciated other recent patriotic films like I, American Sniper and The Lone Survivor. It's well made, and although not sufficiently deep or thematically rich to stand the test of time, it offers a salute to courage, determination, and the importance of diplomacy in developing and cementing alliances for those who enjoy war films, especially those with an old-fashioned bent. A-12 Stronga offers 2 solid hours. 16 years after U.S. troops landed in Afghanistan, the conflict there might be summed up as a violent holding pattern or a stalemate we're still mired in, or if you squint hard enough, a slow-motion qualified success, but only the producer Jerry Bruckheimer would seek to portray it as a victory decisive, enough to be called a triumph of the kick-ass American spirit. 12 Strong, 1 of those rare, serious Bruckheimer productions, tells the story of the first U.S. soldiers to land in Afghanistan in the days after 9/11. The members of ODA 595, an elite special forces unit that was ordered to link up with the local warlord and fight its way village by village to the Taliban stronghold of Mazar Sharif, the country's 4th largest city. There, they would theoretically gut the Taliban's nexus of power and topple the ability of Afghanistan to serve as a training ground for Al-Qaeda troops. Chris Hemsworth in patchy dark hair and a G.I. Joe scruff, speaking in a manly low voice, of Superstar Resolve plays the team's Captain Mitch Nelson, who has never been in combat before, yet he's the kind of gung-ho volunteer who's got sharp shooting in his blood. Killer eyes. The warlord's description of Fam Michael Shannon as Chief Warrant Officer, but he's got a killer heart. A family man who only recently arranged to become a desk jockey. Nelson, as the movie presents it, gets slapped awake by 911 and fights the bureaucracy to win his shot on the ground. As soon as he arrives, he's a master of everything. The weather patterns, how to map bombing, coordinates for the B-52s that are going to blow Taliban-infested villages into the afterlife, and they of course say how to ride into battle on a horse while blasting a machine gun like a badass medieval knight. The American soldiers of OTA 595 defeated the Taliban fighters they were up against, scoring an early blow against the forces of Islamic terrorism. Yet the Taliban, the last time anyone checked, hasn't exactly jumped ship. And the whole issue of what we've accomplished in Afghanistan, of forcing the enemy to a degree to go elsewhere, remains more than a little murky. 12. Strong, though, builds a hermetic screen around the first 3 weeks of the conflict, holding it up to the light as if to say, don't believe the naysayers. American heroism still rocks. I believe that American heroism still does, but that doesn't make 12 Strong an illuminating or overly exciting war film. It's more like cheerleading with ballistics. On its own terms, the film is watchable enough, but it's blunt and solid and undercharacterized. And at 130 minutes, it plots. If there's anything that great war films like Saving Private Ryan or The Hurt Locker have taught us, it's that victory in combat doesn't look like a street fight action movie set in a wilderness hellhole. But 12 Strong is a war film that wants you to feel good about the invincibility of American power. The film is built like a grungy combat video game, with each village treated like a new level and the agony of battle taking a back seat to the pounding thrill of force. At a villain is a dastardly Taliban commander, said Tagmi, who looks like a ratty gutter snipe Frank Zappa in black rags. He's introduced to executing a woman in front of her 2 tearful daughters for the crime of reading. That's not an exaggeration of Taliban cruelty. But the way the film uses this brute to personify evil is at once reductive and uninteresting. He's scary, though not as scary as William Fnair is a shaven-headed colonel who glowers like Gollum. That said, 12 Strong is only mildly demagogic. It salutes the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, building token hints of drama around the relationships between Captain Nelson and Gen Abdul Rashid Dostum, Navidid Nagaban, the Northern Alliance warlord he fights alongside, but clashes with when it comes to military strategy. The two have something to teach each other. And I kept thinking how much this relationship would have popped in a David Lean film. But the script of 12 Strong, written by Ted Talley and Peter Craig, adapting the 2009 bestseller Horse Soldiers, is pretty bare bones. When the general accuses Captain Nelson of being a soldier and not a warrior, we're eager to see Nelson grow into one. But the film barely bothers to demonstrate the difference. The novelty that's the chief selling point of 12 Strong are the act that the members of ODA 595 rode horses to make it through the treacherous terrain doesn't amount to very much. They all seem to know how, and it's not as if contemporary soldiers on horseback look any more exotic than cowboys and Indians. The film's most impressive aspect is its sordid landscapes. 12 Strong was shot in New Mexico, with the mountains there doubling for Afghanistan's famously the craggy and forbidding tableau, and the director, Nicolai Fuglsig, and cinematographer Rasmus Vide use locations to conjure what it might look like to wage war in an endless, sprawling no man's land. Visually, the terrain comes close to raising an existential question. What exactly are we fighting for in Afghanistan? The film slips into pointed and now rather outdated argument that if the Taliban can be defeated and Afghanistan eliminated as an Al-Qaeda base, then there will be no more attacks like 9/11. Well, there haven't been a broken bar. But is that the reason why 12 Strong lends a shape of supreme purpose to a conflict that is still in search of one? The greatest thing that any human can do for another is to sacrifice themselves. Each situation determines the level of sacrifice. However, no greater level of sacrifice occurs than when our servicemen are called to duty. Following the events on September 11th, 2001, the military swiftly and deftly moved into Afghanistan, based on the Noah Horse Soldiers by Doug Stanton. Nicolai Ugal, 602 Stronger, focuses on the elite group of 12 Green Beret members of Operational Detachment, Alpha OTA 595, while Task Force Dagger was the lead company responsible for those early operations. Thine 5 was on the ground pushing through the Taliban's strongholds using unconventional warfare. Chris Hemsworth plays Captain Mitch Nelson, the leader of OTA 595. Mr. Hemsworth's approach to the character was to infuse it with his trademark humor. He also approached the character as a deeply committed man to his family, something we get early on, to his country and to his men and the mission. Most importantly, he earns our trust in the early stages of the film as well, especially as Chief Warrant Officer Spencer, played by Michael Shannon, comes to his aid. Michael Peña plays Sergeant Sam Diller, who offers his own brand of humor, while the acclaimed Tvenant Throd's Moonlight plays Sergeant Ben Milo. Both performers enhance the team on the screen, especially during the action sequences, and both add to the unconventional nature of the film. What makes Mr. Fuglsig's directorial debut so interesting is its unconventional nature. The script by Ted Thalley and Peter Craig builds trust quite quickly in our hero with his swift call to action. This is necessary because part of OTA 595's mission was diplomacy. Captain Nelson not only needed to fight a war in unconventional means, but he also needed to build the trust of General Abdul Rashid Dastam Nav Nagaban while getting in-country support and the lay of the land. The film only touches on this aspect in passing, but does it with the flair of a Jerry Bruckheimer production. Bruckheimer's staple William F. Neer makes an appearance as Colonel Mal Holland, the leader of Task Force Dagger. His dry sense of timing and humor enlightens us as to the precarious nature of this mission and the dangers awaiting OA 595. One of the best sequences in the film is played between Mr. Fichtner and Mr. Hemsworth and is a highlight of the film. Comedian Rob Brigel is yet another unconventional choice if you follow his stand-up and television career. But did you know that he was a Marine? In fact, the name of his character is the name of the man who he reported to as a Marine. It was a delight to see him share screen time with both Mr. Hemsworth and Mr. Fichtner. Mr. Talley and Mr. Craig's script uses all of those elements build us up to a moment of pride as we see OTA 595 on horseback riding through the mountains and yet another unconventional aspect of this mission. The mountains that make up the geography of Afghanistan are some of the most treacherous in the world that they cannot be walked with great ease, which makes for an ideal place for the Taliban regimes to hold out. Never underestimate the determinism and resolve of the United States military. Though this is the hallmark of the producing team that brought USA Only the Brave last fall. The combination of the two production styles truly shines in Mr. Fuglsig's hands. Mr. Fuglsig is a journalist by trade, and much like the subjects of this film, Mr. Fuglsig's past experiences prepared him for this moment. His cipher photography shines in this film through Rasmuside Beck's The Dark Tower Eyes. The amount of pride generated from this film sets aside many of the challenges the story has. It is as if the energy and the bravado from The Rock commit the bravery and the heroism of Only the Breaka with just a sprinkle of fallance. Of Arabia for good measure. 12 Strong is the definition of a bland military move, of falling into nearly every trope in the genre. The film is based on the true story of the horse soldiers. 12 U.S. soldiers who are deployed in Afghanistan to take out Taliban targets following the September 11th attacks. While the true story it is based on is interesting, director Nicolai Fuglsig was unable to translate it to the big screen. The strongest aspect of 12 Strong was the chemistry between the actors. No one puts on an Oscar-winning performance, but Chris Hemsworth, Michael Shannon, Michael Pay the Plus, minus all make for a believable group of soldiers. At times their acting can be a little stiff, but for the most part their banter and exchanges feel realistic. At best, the rest of the movie is just mediocre. The score tries to make the action scenes feel epic or the pep talks inspiring, but it just feels unearned and falls flat. There's nothing visually interesting about 12 Strong either. The brown deserts of Afghanistan don't really allow for much variation in scenery or color, but it doesn't seem like anything more than the bare minimum effort was put into filming. Not every war movie has to be the next Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket. However, it would have been nice if there was at least some artistic merit to it. For a military action movie, the combat scenes were not engaging at all. Nearly every scene began with a drawn-out bombing sequence, which provided nothing besides a gore fest of dismembered limbs being strewn about and completely bored the viewer before any gun could be fired. The special effects were serviceable in the first and second act and completely pathetic in the third. What would have been a real explosion in Act 2 was replaced with an iMovie quality explosion effect in Act 3. There were multiple shots of Alcon members firing their guns with no muzzle flare or sound effect, leaving us looking at background actors violently flailing their guns around to mimic recoil. At times, 12 Strong was flat-out emotionally manipulative. One scene features a small exchange between a child soldier and one of the American soldiers, only to show the child die less than a minute later, when the soldiers finally complete their mission. The film ends in the most tone-deaf way, as if their relatively minor victory meant the war on terror was over. Besides the interactions between characters, very little of 12 Strong made it worth the watch. Weak direction and bad special effects make what would be an otherwise interesting story into a bland, beat-by-beat military movie. The title of the film at 12 Stronger reveals its primary concern. This is the mostly true story of 12 brave American soldiers who, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, were dropped behind enemy lines in Afghanistan to work with the Afghan army, most of whom were mounted cavalry, against the Taliban. The film clearly has a great deal of admiration for its subjects, which is possibly its greatest strength, but is most definitely also the cause of its greatest flaws. The narrative is reductively straightforward. There are good guys and bad guys. The Taliban are depicted murdering women for teaching their daughters past the age of 8. The treatment of women is consistently made to be the main complaint against the Taliban, that in 9/11, of course, the American women are meanwhile depicted as being safely back home baking cookies for the kids and waiting for the boys to come home from defending their freedom. The warlord who is allied with the Americans assures the audience that he has a great deal of respect for women, but there are almost none to be seen in the narrative. The Taliban all cover their faces except for their sinister leader, whilst the Afghan forces don't. This means we need and feel complicated as they are mown down in droves by our heroes. There is one scene dedicated to Chris Hemsworth's Captain Mitch Nelson contemplating his actions, but this isn't picked up again, and only one of his compatriots seems to share his concern. Michael Shannon has one line about the uneasy relationships between being at home and at the front. But this is no hurt locker. The man will all turn out fine. Rest assured, there's no room here for any complexity or thoughtfulness. The lines are clearly drawn with no gray areas. Consequently, there's a jingoistic heart to the film. There's no mention of the American training and equipment that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda received to fight the Russians in the decades prior. There's no resentment of American interventionism from the troops they ally with. There's potential here to tell a tragic story of constantly switching sides and an endless cycle of violence. Instead, there is one really evil guy who once killed will leave. America successfully avenged, and the good warlord will have the upper hand in the region. However, the film also struggles to develop a straightforward narrative, as most of the soldiers are interchangeable sardonic types who offer the odd well. This turned out just PG before fearlessly charging into battle. There's some good-natured joshing amongst the men, which certainly serves well as comedic relief, but there's no attempt to develop any of the men. This is possibly due to this film's reluctance to give any of them significant flaws. This is Noah Lawrence of Arabia, the anonymous character of which is slowly turned savage and cruel in his pursuit of glory and adventure. As you'd expect, Michael Shannon is a tremendous presence, and Michael Pilda ± is charming. Navidid Nagaban is the Allied General Abdul Rashid Dostum, has a quiet dignity that made him very entertaining to watch. Otherwise, some excellent actors are given very little to do. There are, of course, the action scenes. This film is produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, and consequently, there are all the massive explosions and prolonged gunfights you would expect. This is heroic, exciting action, not the gritty kind. Any sense of realism or tension is lost in these over-the-top firefights. The horrors of war are panned past very quickly. Unfortunately, due to a lack of style or investment in these characters, the fights become very dull. Thea is the closest thing to a John Wayne movie since the Duke hung up his holster, although set in Afghanistan in the days. Just after 9/11, when a dirty dozen American Special Forces operatives at a Green Berets, no less, were dropped into off some of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Perpetrators A12 Stronga is both an entertaining and mildly visible reel. Life-inspired yarn that comes off as much like a Western as a modern war film, right down to having some of the Americans ride into battle on horseback. This may be the first big studio release that feels like it was made by and for Trump's America, which should translate into muscular business in red states at least. Here at last is a modern Hollywood film that would be suitable viewing under current management at the White House. But quite apart from the Pirates of the Caribana and the National Treasury as sequels, not to mention the continuing cascade of TV series, this is also the first feature that feels like a real Jerry Bruckheimer production in at least a decade, maybe more. It's got it all. The buff stud military swagger, the innocuous young dude horseplay, the hefty high-tech hardware, the casual can-do attitude, and the one-dimensional approach to character, geopolitics on military adventurism. Go USA! This may also be the first 911-centered Hollywood film aimed partly at viewers who were still in diapers or weren't even born when the World Trade Center was attacked. As this year marks the 17th anniversary, it's based on an action fully detailed for the first time in Doug Stanton's acclaimed 2009 book of Horse Soldiers. That was long classified, that being a very risky incursion by the Americans, along with General Abdul Rashid Dostam's Northern Alliance of Afghan fighters into the Taliban-controlled northern town of Famazar Sharif. The objective was simple and clear. Take the town and you control the north. What makes the story legitimately compelling is that there was no precedent for how to proceed against this shadowy enemy. Young testosterone-loaded soldiers can say they're going to kick ass all they want, and they do. But it's another matter how they're going to go about it under such murky circumstances and so unfamiliar and unfriendly a region. They've got high-tech equipment up the wazoo as well as B-52 air support, and with Thor himself, aka Kissa Hemsworth, leading the charge, how can the outcome be in any doubt? Still, Osa Hemsworth is a Captain Mitch Nelson rightly puts it. There is no playbook here. We're going to have to write it ourselves other than for the fact that a few team members are played by recognizable actors. A Michael Shannon, a Michael Peña, and a driven to Rhodes, and no effort is made to differentiate the majority of the team members. So it's virtually all a Hemsworth Z show, and he's entirely up to the task of carrying the film on his broad shoulders. Nelson is charismatic, fearless, confident, jokey, and a good Kentucky boy who just wants to get the job done and return home to his wife and daughter. The ridiculous imbalance in manpower. The enemy outnumbered the Yanks by 5,000 to 180 unavoidably raises the specter of the Alamo, which you wouldn't think is a good thing given the outcome there. But once they get the support of the Wars Nabadaban, the Americans seem to be on the right track. Dam, who has shifted affiliations countless times, is a real survivor. He was Afghanistan's vice president up until last year when he had to flee under strange circumstances. The script by Ted Thalley, The Silence of the Lambs, and Peter Craig, The Tona, and to Hunger Games as entries is tight and elemental, full of orders, logistics, and a full complement of good boy cracks. What the men were getting themselves into was scary enough. With little preparation, they were dropped under cover of night into forbidding mountain territory overrun with fierce and well-armed fighters whose greatest dream was to kill more Americans. But the biggest challenge for some of them was the one thing they weren't trained for: riding horses, which were the ordinary means of transport for Afghans in this difficult terrain. Nelson does his best to offer instruction and encouragement, but some of the guys just aren't up to it, which is a nice joke. All the same, the tone here is familiar and unvarying. It's all macho all the time, which comes across as a peculiar mixture of appealing, juvenile, sexy, retrograde, jingoistic, and fantasy-inspiring. It may also be the first and only example of a U.S. military adventure in Afghanistan that was a pure and undiluted success. All 12 guys survived. The Taliban was kicked back on its heels, and these Americans all got to go back home to their families. If you want a happy ending to any US. in Afghanistan narrative, maybe you want to quit right here as the film does. So, while this particular real-life drama came out right from the American perspective, there's not a speck of foreshadowing as to what lay ahead of the fact that Afghan political matters remain fraught after all these years, no matter what the U.S. did or does. The sight of Captain Nelson riding on horseback into the face of Taliban missiles, while bombs dropped by AB-52A explode all around him, is admittedly arresting, and it's impossible not to root for this good bunch of guys, but in the end, the John Wayne film that at 12 strong reminds one of his No to Back to Batana or Affordia or The Alamo Abu to the Green Berets, a not for its filmmaking qualities a Danish commercials whiz, Fuglsig directing his first feature and fellow countryman cinematographer Raz Muska do a capable and vigorous job getting the action convincingly on the screen. But for its simplistic, one-dimensional politics and lack of a historical perspective. What they've made is, from the American perspective, a feel-good movie about Afghanistan. Something it took Jerry Bruckheimer to figure out how to do. 12 Stronga has everything you want in a war picture. Almost the action is frequent and gripping. The heroism, present but understated, and the sense of tactical complexity has survived the script writing process. So there is more geopolitical subtlety than one expects from a post-911 American war movie. Dot for the red-blooded American M audience for which it is primarily intended. The also has a heap in helping of the things people in other parts of the world sometimes despise. At a hero shots of American soldiers in slow motion walking towards camera after the successful completion of their mission. The thrilling aerials of the battlefield before and after Armageddon, and the quiet, sentimental moments as real men look at pictures of wives, girlfriends, and kids dreaming of home. It even has the online cliches that every war movie of the last 20 years can't seem to resist. My favorite is Let's Do This. The most interesting part about the 12 Stronga is that some of it, maybe even a lot of it, might be true. But since Hollywood doesn't care about whether it is or not, it's hard to tell which bits they faked. You can be sure some of it never happened. On the other hand, a lot of this feels pretty credible. Even with the compulsory patriotic over-egging, the story concerns 12 American Special Forces men who went into Afghanistan a few weeks after the 9/11 attacks to fight with the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. Their mission was Secret A, which just means it takes a little longer for it to end up becoming a movie. This one has been in planning since 2009, shortly after Doug Stanton's nonfiction book told the story of these men who took the horses to fight with their mainly Pashan allies. Chris Hemsworth has become the world's favorite action man in the last year or two. He's not quite the new Errol Flynn because Errol was never this buff, but he has carved out a remarkable niche, a masculine ideal who's both softer and strong, funny and hard, and capable of making bad lines sound good. He has to use all of those talents here as Captain Mitch Nelson, a brilliant soldier who has never actually seen action. Michael, Shannon plays his mentor who backs him up when he demands to lead his old team into Afghanistan to get the bad guys. Michael Peña is his usual reliable sidekick as Sergeant Diller. And David Nagaban does good work as Northern Alliance General Dostum, who knows more about war than any of these damned Yankees. If this film had been made 20 years ago, I guarantee it would have been much stupider than it is. The American war movie since 9/11 has had to sharpen up. People still want wish-fulfilling action with lots of dead enemy, but they also want to know a bit more about who they are fighting and why. That's where E12 Strong excels. It offers more complexity than most in this genre. Nelson's soldiers are smarter, less gung-ho, and more informed about Afghan politics and history than I expected. The sentimental bits are less clawing. 2, even if still annoying. One major question of American strategy in Afghanistan, whether you can win a war from the air, is front and center in the strategic arguments between the general and the GI. It makes the film less dumb than much of the competition. It's still a shoot-them-up fantasy and the recruiting movie. Like most big-budget war pictures, I have no doubt that some, possibly many American teenagers will watch this and enlist soon after. It doesn't matter how realistic the depictions of death and suffering become. The American war movie basically sells adrenaline wrapped in patriotism. Young men are interested in a bit of both. Nowhere here does it mention that the Americans armed the Taliban to fight the Russians, but I never really expected it would. It may be based on a true story, but it's less than a history lesson. War films generally come in 2 varieties. A great introspective look at its emotional and psychological cost in black and white jingoistic propaganda. The former is generally acclaimed as award W worthy, while the latter is dumped during winter months. So its target audience of an array loving Republicans and American flag tees is something to watch during a drama-heavy, liberally slanted awards season. This doesn't, however, inherently mean one route is better, despite valid arguments to the contrary. And for those who vehemently disagree, it doesn't mean the propagandized truth is without any value. Films of this are easy to be disregarded as two-dimensional, but refusal to understand their value regardless is just plain lazy, because while you may not learn anything, others find themselves healed. It's okay to remain on the surface when that's where the topic exists. There are certain events meet with a universal response that moves beyond thought into immediate action. And sadly, there are even more that should but don't. That is mass domestic shootings. One such moment is September 11th, 2001, and a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center towers. Complain all you want about where the war that erupted went after a botched WME storyline, but George W. Bush was re-elected in 2004 with almost 10 million more votes than the previous highest vote-getter, Ronald Reagan. America was still reeling and in pain. We still wanted those responsible to be found. Revenge was our motivation, a plain and simple. You don't therefore need more to depict it. Nicolai Ugal, 602 Stronga, adapted from Doug Stanton's 2009 book A Horse Soldier by Ted Thalian Peters. Craig, being a hurrah rallying cry of heroism, pitting the American way as superior and protected by God doesn't mean it fails. On the contrary, this result actually brands it a success. The question then becomes whether or not it is good within that accomplishment. How is the action? How is the acting, the drama, the suspense? Just because the film's superficial goal makes its portrayal of the enemy problematically prejudiced. New in a car is obviously villainous. Maler Asen is gratuitously shown murdering women to drive that point home, and unfortunately also reinforce ignorant stereotypes that the Muslims practice Sharia law, doesn't mean it can't still work as an authentic display of the truth. This movie isn't about the intricacies of Islam or the origins of the Taliban. It's not even about Osama bin Laden. A12 Stronger presents a military reaction to an unspeakable tragedy. It's about the 12 men who fought to be the first boots on the ground in Afghanistan to deliver that response. These soldiers saw what happened and instantly sprung to attention to do something about it, as ripping up retirement papers and requests for desk work. So the story consists of controlled rage, unlikely miracles, and strategic victories. It's quite literally about good versus evil, and therefore can be forgiven for leaning so heavily towards that mode. There can be no wiggle room. Captain Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth, and his men are heroes, while Razin is a terrorist. These are empirical facts in the context of what happened. Accepting them should therefore allow you to appreciate the intricate and unbelievable machinations of what transpires. The sheer speed at which our troops were deployed is insane, and their task more so. Nelson had zero combat experience. His team had to meet what many would consider as big warlord and General Dstam Nav Nagaban to form an allegiance, and they all had to rush into a firefight on horseback with only a fraction of the enemy's numbers. They were ordered to free a city experts predicted would take 2 years and only 3 weeks. We don't question why they do it because we all saw those towers fall. We simply watch how they managed to complete the impossible. Besides one short scene, back home with their wives watching Donald Rumsfeld on television, Fuglsig stays in Afghanistan after the team arrives. The mission was classified, so there's no real point going stateside except for emotional manipulation that the story doesn't need to succeed with 9/11 still fresh. Instead, we witness Nelson growing into his position of leadership while pushing back against Dostum. We start to understand the long odds they face, the secondary war being waged, Dostum against a tenuous Northern Alliance ally, and what's at stake if they fail. There's humor thanks to an authentic rapper and Michael Pilda +-A as Sam Diller. Humanity in the cliché, Dilda copyright the yet honest relationships between Ben Milo Travins and his young Shadow Arivi's Nib and immense courage. By all suspense holds steady with visits to Colonel Mal Holland, William Fnair, and Lieutenant Colonel Bowers, Rob Brigel, 2nd G, guessing Nelson's odds and the always surprising wrinkles being thrown Mitch's way on the ground. Michael Shannon's House Spencer may appear to be here for sage wisdom, but he ultimately takes a back seat like his compatriots Jeff Stoltz, Austin Stwell, and Bonacula, amongst others. This is Hemsworth's show as his Nelson steps up without one iota of doubt by making tough calls. He also has to be on his toes. Opposite DSM, a character with personal reasons of his own that do cut deeper than ours could, considering his people face attacks daily. Nagaban is easily the best actor here, and yet Hemsworth holds his own for some gravitas above A-list celebrity. And despite any preconceptions as far as subject matter is concerned, A12 Stronga is a unique modern war movie because of the logistics involved. This fight is portrayed on screen as a hybrid of war on terror tactics and those from centuries ago. The juxtaposition of tanks and Landtor missiles against a cavalry of soldiers is pretty intense as a result. Does watching a bunch of locals getting shot while Hemsworth rides through unscathed get laughable? Sure, but this is a true story and people have to die for others to live. Whether you see that as divine intervention, which honestly makes you no better than an enemy doing the same, or sheer luck is on you. Fuglsig's job was to document, commemorate, and inspire. He does all three. 12. Strong drops more literal bombs than emotional ones in an overtly explosive new feature starring Chris Hemsworth. Based on a book by Doug Stanton, 12 Strong details a gritty but true war story about the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif. Hemsworth stars as Captain Mitch Nelson, leader of a band of Special Forces soldiers who are sent into the trenches of Afghanistan following the disastrous 911 attacks. Nelson and his 12 men embark on a mission to capture the city of Mazar-Sharif and work side by side with General Abdul Rashid Dam Navid Nagaban, the leader of the alliance in Afghanistan. Although based on a true story, 12 Strong rings hollow due to its focus on lengthy action scenes rather than on character development and plotline. The movie's title, 12 Strong, references the 12 United States soldiers who against all odds triumphed against the risks of a classified government mission. Unfortunately, it would be generous to imply that even 3 of the 12 men have more than a generic backstory. Even after dedicating a significant portion of the film to building up the soldiers' lackluster relationships with their families, the ending rails against any emotional impact their familial relationships may have had. The reunion after the war, which should have served as the emotional climax, became a briefly glossed over scene. For instance, the last 3 minutes of the film show Nelson returning home to his wife and child in a hasty scene, devoid of dialogue or cinematic techniques to heighten the emotional impact. Although it is admittedly difficult to create a morally nuanced antagonist when the enemy is the Taliban, 12 Strong is too comfortable in its assumption that it can spend little time defining a notorious enemy. The movie relies too heavily on the fact that most people enter the theater with an understanding of the Taliban's heinous acts. As a result, the film doesn't show many aspects of the Taliban's culpability within the frame of the movie. Even a single scene in the entire film that touches upon the evil of the Taliban. A mother killed for educating her daughters seems stilted because the movie makes explicit only one instance of depravity while leaving the rest to implication. The lack of characterization amid spilled blood and gore makes 12 Strong indistinguishable from any movie of the same genre. The film handled the consistency of its details in a similarly clumsy manner. As 12 Strong takes place in Afghanistan, director Nicolai Fuglsig employs several different languages such half the time because of the movie's inconsistency in providing subtitles. AI shame because the use of foreign language was otherwise well balanced throughout the film. Early on in the film, Nelson meets Dustin for the first time and cannot understand the language that the general and his men speak. The lack of subtitles in the scene is logical as it parallels the sense of otherness Nelson feels in a foreign country. The directorial choice could be construed as a clever way to draw Nelson and the audience together by means of an isolating language barrier. However, the movie provides subtitles for an interaction shortly afterward and destroys the sentiment of alienation. In a scene where Dostum and his men discuss the gifts the Americans brought to show their goodwill, the newly added subtitles provide a translation of the interaction despite the dialogue lacking any real significance to the overall plot. Perhaps the weakest part of the movie is its glorification of war as it attempts to convince the audience it presents a tale of humanity, save for the occasional near death or loss. Most of the war scenes resemble the way 12-year-old boys might play paintball and lack a sense of gravitas to weigh down the situation. Heads explode to gleeful reactions and bombs are dropped indiscriminately without reluctance. The touching lessons the men are meant to learn from war come off as little more than elementary school platitudes. Where 12 Strong succeeds, however, is in its portrayal of the companionship among the men in Task Force Unit Operational Detachment, Alpha 595. The dialogue in barracks and battle scenes never seems forced, and an actual camaraderie exists among them. From the playful jostling to the in-jokes, such as the ribbing one soldier receives for being loyally guarded by a prepubescent Afghan boy. It is a joy to watch them interact every time they are on screen, making it all the more wrenching when any of them are injured on the battlefield. The movie would have benefited from focusing more upon the relationships among the men, perhaps, then it would not have been overwhelmed by the war scenes. 12 Strong ultimately establishes itself as a decent film trapped within an average one by placing an inordinate amount of focus on the action scenes when the center of attention should have been on the players of the war. Although there may be some heart hidden within the scripts of the 12 men, it is not enough to raise the movie into anything memorable. 12 Strong seems like a pretty straightforward war film. We have a hero who promises his family he will make it home, a team who has to complete an almost impossible task in a short amount of time, and a ton of action sequences. However, there are gray areas in the film that make it intriguing. The soldiers have to go to battle on horses. Yeah, horses. It's shocking to me that in the 21st century, with all of our technology, we would still be using horses in the war, but it's happening. Not to mention, the Americans work alongside General Dam, Navad Nagaban, an Afghan warlord, on their journey. Is he trustworthy? Will he turn on them? This storyline shows the audience that not everything in war is a black and white concept. But a huge aspect of 12 Strong is the action. The film's action sequences feel extremely repetitive based on the shaky camera work and frequent explosions. There are sequences where you can't even tell what's going due to the camera work. It feels like watching a video game. Sure, it could be an artistic choice, but it's 2018 and Dunkirk was just released. ... It's safe to say audiences can expect great action sequences in war movies now. The cast portraying the team includes a strong group of actors including Chris Hemsworth as Captain Mitch Nelson, Michael Shannon as House Spencer, Michael Peña as Sam, Trevent Rhodes as Ben, and Jeff Stoltz as Ben. Chris Hemsworth and Michael Shannon are the two most highlighted characters in the film with strong background stories. It would have been nice to see some of the other members of the teams get a bit more development, but I understand it would have taken up too much time. Each actor gives a convincing performance and they work well together as a team. Side note is Michael Shannon, taking over Hollywood. He's in everything I see now. Chris Hemsworth firing a carbine, riding tall and proud in the saddle. That image more or less captures what you need to know about 12 Strong, a movie with a veneer of seriousness and the slam bamboo soul of the Jerry Bruckheimer production. It opens under a pall on the morning of September 11th. Mitch Nelson, Mr. Hemsworth, a special forces officer, has just moved into a new home with his family and is watching the Twin Towers burn on TV. Soon, he and his team are choking on Dustina, Afghanistan, where references to the Alamo mix with the spirit of John Wayne Shangoism. There's a story here, but first and foremost, there are men, tough, hard-bodied, soulful men, the kind who, in volcanic frustration, will slam hands as big as Easter hams against walls, and who can, as mitched as while idling in a military office, say, flip over a desk as lightly as if he were chucking a toy truck. Other hard-bodied men see his hurt, but as strong, discreet brothers, they too keep their feelings in check. "Nice kill," a comrade archly says, surveying the ruins of Mitch's desk. 12 Strong has just begun, but its world of masculine pain, private anguish, and commitment to violence is already firmly in place. The movie shifts into a steady action groove once the not especially dirty dozen lands in Afghanistan. There, the Americans wearily join forces with General Dostum, a charismatic Navad Nagaban, a warlord who they hope will join them in their fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Dustin views Mitch with skepticism and favors his subordinate Hal Spencer. Michael Shannon, Hal Dostum notes approvingly, has killer eyes, which Mr. Shannon certainly doesn't disprove. Once Team USA and Team Afghan stop glowering and growling at each other, a posy hits the trail on horseback and Dostum and Mitch settle into a mentor-student bond that evokes the Karate Kid in The Road to Wisdom for devotees of cinematic blowouts and dedicated students of screen masculinity like me. 12 Strong is premium-grade catnip directed by the newcomer Nicolai Fuglsig. It is generally watchable if unsurprisingly easier on the eyes than on the ears or brain. It's well stocked with dependable actors and ornamented with swooping arrow shots of the severely beautiful landscape. New Mexico stands in for Afghanistan. There are pretty horses, echoes of heroic westerns, and a half-hearted rendition, a pitched between sincerity and irony. Of the Ballad of the Green Berets, the agono that hit the chart scene in 1966, when the United States was on its way to losing the war in Vietnam. Winning and losing aren't the point of 12 Strong, and neither are politics, the present, the past, the United States, or Afghanistan. Its reason for being is brotherhood, as belief in way of life. It sings of how men become warriors and of how they can reach across seemingly impossible divides to clasp hands and lock eyes before blowing their mutual enemy to pieces. And while September 11th gives Mitch and his men their mission, the locals aren't entirely ignored. Not movie underscores most forcefully in a scene of a Taliban leader, Malar Razin, Newman terrorizing a family that has educated its daughters. Still, while the movie largely elides overt politics and policies, both domestic and foreign, they are inextricably embedded in every single narrative turn, each word and image. They're also embedded in the credits. Like other movies of this type, 12 Strong received technical support from the American military, written by Tad Talley and Peter Craig, and adapted from Doug Stanton's well-received nonfiction book, Horse Soldiers 2009. The movie takes for granted that military action in Afghanistan is essential and justified. The filmmakers make that case mostly with images of September 11th, a cut to a man's clenching fist, and through scenes and stories of the Taliban's violence. The periodic references to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan suggest that the larger picture is awfully complicated. Real complications, though, are for other movies. We're now almost 17 years into the War of Afghanistan, the longest in American history. That's a deeply sobering marker, but one that has no place in 12 Strong, which starts as a recruitment tad before settling into a tense, unremittingly brutal combat movie. Mr. Fuglsig's contribution to this basically well-coordinated mayhem, which includes fiery explosions, a Bruckheimer trademark, is hard to gauge. It also scarcely matters when bodies rise and fall to a beat as natural as our circadian rhythms. About an hour into it 12 Strong, I started to realize that I was periodically tuning out to mentally watch the better films that were so obviously being cannibalized. Where the best war movies present the atrocities of combat as nothing short of pure horror, here's one that looks at bloodshed as a thrilling adventure brought to you by the producer of F.A. Pirates of the Caribbean. Director Nicolai Fuglsig has taken the harrowing true story and made a film that feels like an adaptation of A Call of a Game, loosely based on it. It's a glossy over-long blob of nothing heroically riding in on horseback. It's almost as if this film intentionally avoids any possible nuances that could have come from spinning a yarn about the first major American victory in the War on Terror. While there's obviously nothing but respect here for the brave men who are portrayed, the so-called characters that bear their names are lazy trope buggies who exist only to dispense out the same old verbiage about brotherhood and bravery that would sound right at home in Aeotropic Thunder. Heaven forbid we think anything remotely negative about their studs in Como. So they're each just about as virtuous and brave as movie characters can be. These flat characters strangle a talented cast, none of whom get to play to their strength here. While it goes without saying that Chris Hemsworth has the looks and build of a leading man, he brings absolutely nothing to the table. Hemsworth shines the most when he heavily deprecates his square-jaw pretty boy image, but he leans right into it here in the performance generic as sin. He seems more invested in fighting off his Australian accent than he ever does his enemies. Meanwhile, Truven Rhodes and Michael Pay, the plus-minus, are rattle-off onliners, while Michael Shannon desperately tries to wring some personality out of his kind-hearted second-in-command with minimal success. The only standout character is General Dostum Nav Nagaban, the head of a local militia who join up with our boys to fight the Taliban. Nagaban infuses Dustin with earnest conviction, delivering his cheeseball dialogue in a way that almost makes it sound like something a human being might say. Better, more self-reflective film might have allowed him to be the lead character. Seeing this conflict from the perspective of a native person who sees Americans dominate a battle that has caused his people pain for his entire life would have been fascinating. But of course, then this wouldn't be a proper American story, would it? Fuglsig is clearly a graduate of the Michael Bass School of Action Filmmaking, and in fairness to him, there's a fair amount of technical skill on display here. He gives the battles a look that is both gritty and grand, balancing putting us in the middle of the fighting while still giving his camera the space to capture the big payoff moments. That said, this is some of the glossiest and least intense war violence captured on screen in some time. When men get hit with bullets or blow up, they'll just fall to the ground with a small spurt of red. We never feel like we're fighting other human beings. They're targets in a video game that need to be dinged off in order to hit the next checkpoint. Say what you will about Mel Gibson or David Ayer, but they can make a war zone feel like a nightmare, and that sensibility is sorely missed here. There's also a numbing sameness to every fight sequence. They're all set on the same sandy mountainsides with soldiers screaming and taking cover before they stylishly ride in with their horses and go to town. It gets sold really fast, especially since there's so much of it that could come out to trim down the seemingly endless 2 hours and 10 minutes. 12 Stronga is about as basic a film as one could make about something. As complex as war, it views our world as black and white and as such tells a lengthy story that ultimately never amounts to anything. Beyond weren't those American men brave. It's not even the only film of this type coming out in the next 30 days with Clint Eastwood's of the 1517 to Parisa, out in just a couple of weeks. Wait it out for that one, which will at the very least let the real-life subjects it portrays be in their own generic movie about their heroism. For those who were not alive when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the biggest terrorist attack ever on United States soil happened on September 11th, 2001. The Taliban targeted major buildings in the Northeast, setting off a wave of panic and patriotism across this country. Of course, this also set our military into action. And unbeknownst to most of us, a group of 12 men led an army in Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban in an effort to stave off future attacks. Based on true events, A12 Stronger tells their story. Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth. A Thor Ragnarok is a captain who had just been relegated to a desk job at his own request. However, 9/11 he decided he wanted back in and wants to put his team together and lead an initiative in the Middle East. After some reluctance, he commanding officer agrees, and he and his team find themselves on the way to the Afghan border. They are one of 5 teams waiting for orders regarding what to do next. When Nelson and his team are chosen to go in first, they are dropped behind enemy lines with instructions to meet a warlord named General Dostum, Navidid Nagaban, homeland. Once they meet up with Dustin, they are tasked with using him and his soldiers to strategically attack the Taliban in an effort to retake control of the city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Dane Nelson, who has never seen actual combat before, must gain Dostum's trust and lead this group of untrained men through the mountains and desert armed only with guns and horses and aerial strikes to clear their path. Adding to the tension, Nelson must get DSM to Mazar-e-Sharif before the warlords of the Northern Alliance to solidify his position of power. Amazingly, against incredible odds, Nelson and his team of 11 soldiers managed to take Mazar-e-Sharif in only 3 weeks. Hemsworth is an interesting choice for Nelson, but I'm not sure the best one. He is a pretty boy with a commanding presence, but he lacks some of the acting chops that would have made Nelson more multidimensional. In one particular scene. After his first real taste of combat, Hemsworth shows signs of internal conflict about killing, but that doesn't quite come across his face. Michael Shannon Nocturnal Animals, however, as Nelson's chief, is amazing. While his dialogue isn't always plentiful, his facial expressions speak volumes. Michael Peña is also very good doing what he does best, providing comic relief much of the time. Director Nicolai Fuglsig, X-Film, does a wonderful job of bringing the war in the Middle East to life. To his credit, he uses very little of the shaky cam effect that I typically find rather annoying, as close-ups are poignant and the sweeping vistas of the desert are isolating and magnificent all at the same time. There were only a couple of times I thought the scenery looked fake, and only once did I think a battle scene went on too long. When I first heard about this movie, I thought, oh, another war movie. But this one sets itself apart in a few ways. A1 is set in the desert of the Middle East. It shows that these soldiers had to be trained in a different way than if they were fighting in a forest. 2, unlike other war films, Nelson and his men seem to be excited and eager to start their mission. This is in stark contrast to movies where young men are nervous and scared to head into battle. This mentality gave me a different view of these brave men and their thought processes. One I will admit I found to be crazy and off-kilter. It's early morning on September 11th, 2001. Captain Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth, has recently come home after a training mission in Kuwait. He's hanging out with his family when live footage of the World Trade Center attack comes on a TV in the background. The scene switches to a short while later, and a group of soldiers in the midst of a rural training mission on American soil. They're wondering why jet fighters are flying so low. Could it be part of a drill? That answer has already been shown in the first scene. Captain Nelson had just been heading up the training of an elite team of Green Berets. But that group of men was disbanded when the exercises were completed. He's been reassigned to a period of desk duty, all part of the job, but now that the world has suddenly changed, he wants back in and he wants the same team. The catch though he was out in the field. He has no actual combat experience, and his commanding officer won't give him the assignment based on the once classified true events chronicled in the 2009 book Horse Soldiers. The film gives a look at the problems and disruption of being part of a military family and what that can do to the spouses and kids of the men and women who were sent off to do battle. Then it tells what happened next. On October 16th, Captain Nelson and his team, among them Chief Warrant, Officer Hal Spencer, Michael Shannon, and Sergeant First Class Sam Diller, Michael Peña, are indeed back together in a plane heading to Afghanistan. One of many teams to make that flight. They were told that Osama bin Laden is the brains of the problem there, but the Taliban are the muscle. Their mission was to get up close and friendly with one of the local warlords. A powerful man named General Dostum Navad Nagaban would be that contact A, and under his guidance make their way to Taliban-infested Mazar-e Sharif, the largest city in northern Afghanistan. Once they were close enough to get exact coordinates, they would call in for airstrikes on the city. Another catch. Only one of those special forces teams consisting of 12 men would be sent in. That was Captain Nelson's team, all of whom were gung-ho to do it, even though they were aware that there would be no backup, no help for them if they got in trouble. In a story filled with catches, the next significant one was that Captain Nelson and his Americans didn't completely trust General Dostum and his Afghanis. And the feeling on Dostum's side was mutual. The Americans knew they were fish out of water. Dostum's main problem was that Captain Nelson didn't have killer eyes. Their shared mistrust becomes one of the film's motifs and adds to the already constant tension. You have to wonder if that mistrust will ever have a chance of turning to mutual respect. But there are many other things going on. The Taliban are presented as vicious thugs who have no second thoughts about killing their own people. The American forces are told that because of the terrain, the only way for them to get deep enough into Afghanistan is by horseback. Unfortunately, the only one of them with any riding experience is Captain Nelson. For the most part, the film has more walking and talking and riding than action until very realistic violence does break out in all of its horror. At one point, there's an amazing firefight in the mountains and on the ground, on foot, on horseback, and in tanks. At another, there are spectacular visuals from above of explosions down below. Close to the end, it all turns into a genuine war is hell scenario. For those fans wondering about Chris Hemsworth's capabilities beyond playing Thor, let it be said that he gives a strong and sturdy performance here with no wisecracking. So yes, he proves that he can also handle a leading role as a mere mortal, feeling more like an escape into cinemas than a release. No press screening over here. A12's Strongest sees Chris Hemsworth taking a break from all things authority to bring a true story from the war in Afghanistan to the big screen. Based on the Doug Stanton nonfiction bestseller Soldiers, A12, Stronga follows the first U.S. Special Forces team sent to Afghanistan in the wake of September 11th. Its mission was to help General Abdul Rashid Dostum of the Northern Alliance liberate the Taliban stronghold of Mazar-e-Sharif. Dialing down his charisma, Hemsworth plays Captain Mitch Nelson, inspired by real-life officer Mark Notch, the commander with no combat experience who must try to earn Dostum's Homeland Star avid Nagaban trust while ensuring that interfactional hostilities do not derail the U.S. mission. With winter approaching, Nelson has 3 weeks, 11 men and 6 horses. Former photojournalist Nicolai Fuglsig makes his directorial debut with the 12 Strong, and the DNE's real-life conflict experience gives the film the all-important urgency that it needs from the off after a brief recap of the 1993 World Trade Center attack, the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, and the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. The story moves to September 11th as Hemsworth's character watches the atrocity unfold in his living room. From that scene onwards, there is seldom a pause for breath. The same grit and intensity that were found in A Lone Survivor, the American Sniper. In the 13 Hours, the secret soldiers of Benga area on offer here with Dustin, telling a Nelson, "You don't have the stomach for everything I know." While those Beck sees Nelson as a soldier, not a warrior, their growing regard for each other is the emotional heart of Fat 12 Stronger, and it deserved more scenes. Away from the battlefield, those for whom any film starring Michael Shannon is an appointment to view will also be disappointed to hear that the character acting a great, doesn't have enough screen time as Hemsworth's second in command. The chemistry is there but isn't maximized. First of all, whatever side of the political aisle you may be on, it has to be said that we can't thank the men and women of the armed forces enough for what they do to protect the freedoms of all Americans and those that ask for America's help. 12 Strong tells the story of the first Special Forces team deployed to Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. Under the leadership of a new captain, Mitch Nelson, Chris Hemsworth, the team must work with Afghan warlord General Dostum Navin to take down the Taliban. It's a true story that remained classified for a number of years before being told in Doug Stanton's book Horse Soldiers. It's a fascinating story, but ultimately 12 Strong is a medium-rare cheeseburger of a movie. It's got Americent. It's slightly undercooked. It's not quite as full of flavor as it could be, and it certainly has a few moments that could be considered cheesy. Hemsworth leads the ensemble cast that also boasts, among others, the always reliable Michael Shannon, dependably consistent Michael Pilda, plus minus a solid but underused T-Vent Rhodes, the never bad William Thickner, and the always welcome Rob Brigel in a rare dramatic role. While all of the cast do their best with the parts they have been given, only a handful of the characters feel truly cohesive as a unit, while the others orbit, doing what they do well but just never connecting in the same way with each other or the audience. When there is the need for drama, it gives it to you, and when there is the need for levity, it gives it to you, and they work well together with the balance being just about right. However, in between all of that, it rumbles along rather than driving forward with purpose and any real tension. One of the other bumps in the road for 12 Strong is the dialogue. While the film is never trying or pretending to be a war movie like Black Hawk Down or Platoon or Saving Private Ryan, there are moments that Arlie chilled a copyright D enough to actually do the cast and the film something of injustice. They all deserve better than that. What 12 Strongest deserve to be praised for is that, while it is patriotic to the core, it managed to avoid veering into being jingoistic. As the Special Forces team continue through their mission, going from battle to battle, it begins to feel a touch repetitive as the men discuss their next move, then carry it out, then regroup and deal with casualties, and then do the same thing the next step along the way. While it's interesting to hear Hemsworth and his Afghan counterparts strategize, clash, debate, and resolve their differences, tonally it doesn't quite feel righter, and at times comes off as a touch too pedestrian rather than imperiled. That said, when the action kicks in, those sequences are dynamic and impressive and deliver the shock and all intended. Bearing in mind that this is a Jerry Bruckheimer production, 12 Strong is one of his more restrained and considered exercises in hero storytelling, even if some of the beats it tries to hit are slightly off. That said, it's aiming for brains as well as Brune as much as it is shock and awe, and as a whole, it's not as far off the mark as some people might expect it to be. It's called the Graveyard of Empires, and for good reason. The dry, mountainous, untamed, and untamable land known now as Afghanistan baffled. Afghanistan, sheltered by the country's extremist Taliban regime. Afghanistan is untamed and perhaps untamable, perhaps even within its own borders. Yes, the Taliban says it's in control, but a bevy of warlords disputes that claim. The country wavers between Islamic Sharia law and utter lawlessness, and that offers a bit of an opening for the United States military, which is eager to prevent another terrorist attack on American soil, will be in this fight, Boy says. Captain Mitch Nelson? Mark my words, Mitch technically shouldn't be enough on a fight. He recently accepted a desk job, a better, safer spot to care for his wife and kids. His Special Forces team was being reassigned. But when he watched the towers go down in New York, Mitch's plans changed. Soon he and his men find a way to reband and head to Afghanistan. Their assignment to seek out and partner with Gen Abdul Rashid Dostum, a warlord who fights the Taliban in Afghanistan's barren mountains. Al-Qaeda delivered a devastating blow to America on September 11th. Mitch and his men, a commander tells him, will be the first ones to fight back. But it won't be easy. These 12 men will face a fighting force of thousands supported by tanks and rockets. DSTM's forces number only a few hundred tanks. DSTM has no tanks, only Harusi. Hardly the sort of mounts made for success in modern warfare. Then, of course, Mitch and his men will have to navigate the complicated minefield of alliances and rivalries that exists in Afghanistan. Warlords who hate the Taliban and who hate each other nearly as much. Graveyard of empires. Yes, Afghanistan has earned that title, but Mitch and his men have no ambition to overturn 2,000 years of history. They merely want to do their jobs and kick the Taliban in the teeth, all the while praying that Afghanistan doesn't become a graveyard. Two positive elements. 12, Strongka is based on an actual American military operation that has only recently been declassified. For those with the end for heroic military personnel who selflessly and sacrificially performed their duties, this film has a lot to offer. That and lots of explosions. Mitch and his squadron know they're putting themselves at risk of serious harm. Of course, that's an inescapable part of their job, but they believe that what they're doing will protect the homes and people they love. We hear repeatedly that taking the fight to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban is the only way to prevent another tragic attack on U.S. soil. We see some of the families they're leaving behind, which gives us a sense of the sacrifice made by their spouses and children too. But not all families take news of the mission well. Hal Spencer, the team's chief warrant officer, tells his son that he loves him before he goes. The boy, who's perhaps in his early teens, simply turns away without saying a word, as starkly realistic portrait of what can happen in some military families. But most of the families accept the nature of the job, dealing with the endemic fear and loss as well as they can. Mitch's wife gives him an order. I don't care how long you're gone as long as you come back. Mitch makes her a promise. Keep will come back, and he vows to bring the rest of the men under his authority home too. It's a tricky promise to make given the circumstances, but it's meant sincerely. Spiritual elements Afghanistan's Taliban adheres to an extreme form of Islamic law, and we see evidence of that extremism. In one town controlled by the organization, a black lad man in a position of authority quizzes a handful of little girls about their level of education as females. A woman, possibly the girl's mother, kneels nearby. When he coaxes out the correct spelling of the word giraffe from one and deduces that another knows how to multiply, he executes the mother, despite her appeals to save her in the name of God, reminding the surrounding throng that no girl should be educated beyond the age of others. Shout, God is great. We also see other women in burqas through Dostum. The film offers another view of faith. The Afghan warlord tells Mitch that while Mitch has many people over him, Dustin is governed only by God. He reminds Mitch that the Americans have good homes and lives to protect. For those in Afghanistan, however, their difficult lives make the Islamic art life look more attractive yet, which in turn makes them more willing to die to achieve it. The American brass sends Mitch a variety of gifts to grease the wheels of partnership with any warlords they might encounter. When a CIA operative sees a bottle of vodka among the gifts, he quips, "That'll go over. Great in a Muslim country." The religion forbids partaking of any alcoholic drinks. When Mitch's wife wants Mitch to promise her that he'll come back home safely, he initially refuses, saying that it's bad luck. Sexual romantic. Content sergeant. Sam Diller wants to have sex with his wife before leaving for Afghanistan, making a crash suggestion about what he's got in mind. His wife, though, refuses, holding out. "Is the only way I can guarantee you'll come back to me," she tells him. A member of Mitch's team views a Taliban video of a woman being executed for getting pregnant out of wedlock violent content. When Mitch and Dustin meet, Dostum initially refuses to talk with Mitch because he says Mitch lacks killer eyes. The warlord can see at a glance that Mitch hasn't killed anyone. Mitch rectifies that many times before this movie is through. We see plenty of violence and blood in this war movie. Countless people fall down dead, most of them shot. While many of the deaths are relatively bloodless, others come with an accompanying splash of blood. Some combatants are blown up by grenades or rockets. One suicide bomber kills himself and several others with a massive explosion. We see what appear to be bloody body parts scattered around the blast zone. One man suffers a terrible injury described as a sucking chest wound. We see other injuries to one man frantically tries to revive another, his mouth stained in blood. We don't see much of the wound, but the soldier sticks his hand into the man's uniform and pulls it out, covered in blood. Explosions sent horses and men flying. In the aftermath of a battle, we see bodies of both strewn everywhere. Explosions and gunfire riddle the film. A woman is executed in a village square. Before she's killed, a man pulls off the bora covering she wore on her head, revealing that she'd been cruelly beaten already. Her face is bloody and bruised. Someone executes her with a bullet to the head, accompanied by a splash of blood, and her body lies lifeless in the square, her eyes staring at nothing as her children wail in the background. Mitch's team members tackle a pair of gun-toting men, being unsure of whether they are friends or foes, and indeed it can be very difficult to tell in Afghanistan. Mitch and his team learn that each of them has a bounty on his head from the Taliban, $100,000 for one of their dead bodies, $50,000 for a bloody uniform. That's it, one exclaims. We see news footage from 9/11 as well as other terrorist attacks, crude or profane language, nearly 45 words, and about 25 swords. Other profanities include Accommodant, Ha, and PSS. God's name is misused more than 15 times, most with the word and connected. Jesus' name is abused 10 times. Drug alcohol. Content. Mitch gives DSTM a bottle of vodka as a gift. As mentioned in per-ritual content, it's an EFF's gratefully and drinks straight from the bottle having, it would seem, some experience in quaffing alcohol. Other note for the elements, Ben, a member of Mitch's force, bristles at a kid in Dostam's posy who perpetually follows him around, even eyeing him as Ben urinates. Ben learns that because of the bounties placed on the Americans, Dostam has each of the men guarded. The boy is Ben's bodyguard. Conclusion, Mitch Nelson may be the leader of his 12-man team, but in many ways he's one of its least experienced members. He's never killed a man before arriving in Afghanistan, and when he does so during a bloody skirmish, the experience rocks him. One of his men sidles over to him. He tells Mitch that every now and again he's met people in the military who seems unfazed by the bloody work they must do. They kill with ne'er a blink. The Solider says that once upon a time he envied such men. Now he doesn't. He welcomes the complex feelings that come with a kill. Now, that's the thing that reminds us that we're humans. He says, I had a chance to talk with Mark Nutt and Bob Bennington, soldiers on whom the characters Mitch Nelson, played by Chris Hemsworth, and Hal Spencer, Michael, Shannon were based. According to Bennington A12 Strong, it does an accurate job of depicting what a special forces team is all about, while the movie takes some liberty with the feelings of isolation and the stress and fear that families left behind feel are spotted in this film. 12 Stronga is a previously classified true story opulated by heroes. And while it does indeed remind us that war is a bloody, brutal business, it insists that it's necessary business too. The lives spent on the battlefield may well save others back home. The brutal, searingly intense 12 Strong tells the story of a long classified mission in which a dirty dozen special ops members infiltrated enemy lines to uneasily collaborate with the warlord and mercenary Ladina Northern Alliance to seize control of the Taliban strongholds. In the vengeful and discombobulated days after 9/11, as the media focused on shock and awe in Iran, a covert campaign was underway to strike at the Taliban's heart in Afghanistan. The brutal, searingly intense 12 Strong tells the story of a long classified mission in which a dirty dozen special ops members infiltrated enemy lines to uneasily collaborate with the warlord and mercenary Ladina Northern Alliance to seize control of the Taliban strongholds. With winter looming, the squad had only 3 weeks to complete the mission before winter would come and help the terrorist supporting regime fortify its positions. Outnumbered and outgunned on inhospitable terrain, the soldiers had to resort to unconventional tactics, spending much of their time on horseback to march through the terrain. Over-the-top action maestro producer Jerry Bruckheimer shows surprising restraint in the combat scenes, going against his usual paradigm by proving how less can be more. He deploys shellings, RPG launches, and especially airstrikes sparingly, giving them all the more impact when they snap the soldiers out of LS with the skull-shaking horror of war. Again, Grizzle led by Chris Hemsworth, Michael Shannon, and Michael Peña lead the way with bombastic aplomb. While their performances shade close to gung-ho archetypes, Hemsworth shows more nuance as the hammer-swinging immortal Thor. The lack of nuance doesn't stifle the tone or momentum. And some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting, and if you like this video, please like it, share it, and forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.